Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Welcome to Cineversary, a new podcast that celebrates a milestone anniversary of a cinematic classic. Every month we wish a happy birthday to a different film currently observing a joyous jubilee, everything from a 20th to a 100th anniversary. I'm your host, Erik Martin, creator and moderator of the Cineverse Film Discussion Group that meets weekly in the Chicagoland area. This month we're commemorating the 40th anniversary of one of the finest horror movies of all time, Halloween, directed by John Carpenter. And like any good birthday party, we invite special guests to partake in the commemoration. Joining me this month will be not one, but two guests. First, Tommy Lee Wallace, production designer and editor on Halloween, and director of horror titles like Halloween 3, Fright Night 2, and even the It television miniseries. And secondly, Dr. Kyle Bishop, a professor of film and English at Southern Utah University, also the author of the book How Zombies Conquered Popular Culture, and a frequent guest host on the Horror Movie Podcast. I'll talk with Tommy and Kyle about why Halloween is worth celebrating all these years later, its cultural impact and legacy, what we can learn from the picture today, how it stood the test of time, and more. But prior to carving up this pumpkin, here's some context on our spotlight film this month. Per Wikipedia, Halloween is a 1978 American slasher film directed and scored by John Carpenter, co-written with producer Deborah Hill, and starring Donald Pleasance and Jamie Lee Curtis in her film debut. It was shot in the spring of 1978 in Southern California and was released on October 25th by Compass International Pictures. It grossed $47 million at the box office in the United States and $23 million internationally for a total of $70 million worldwide, selling almost 30 million tickets in 1978 and becoming one of the most profitable independent films of all time based on its budget of approximately $300,000. Halloween currently holds a 93% certified fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes. To put you in the proper spirit, step into the Wayback Machine as we listen to the original trailer.
Halloween night. A small American town. 15 years ago.
Michael?
Halloween.
I spent 8 years trying to reach him, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil. I think he'll come back.
Exploring uncharted territory.
And totally charted.
Just talk.
Sure. The only reason she babysits is to have
Halloween.
Okay, come on out. Halloween, the night he came home.
Note that the conversation to follow contains spoilers, so if you haven't already seen the original Halloween, pause this podcast, get thee to a TV screen, and catch up already. Okay, everybody back? Let's begin our descent into the maelstrom. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our first guest, filmmaker Tommy Lee Wallace, longtime friend to John Carpenter, and, as you'll learn, a major contributor to the first Halloween movie. Welcome, Tommy, and thanks for participating in our Cineversary podcast. Tommy, how did you get involved in making Halloween? What was your relationship and rapport at the time with John Carpenter and Deborah Hill?
Well, by the time Halloween came along, John and I had enjoyed a good working relationship on several previous movie experiences, as well as going back all the way to grade school together. So it was just a fairly natural progression through kind of knowing each other a little bit as in childhood. We were both in the same school. He was a year older than me. Then we became very close as teenagers. We both made music together and kind of formed our little Peter, Paul, and Mary group, and then later formed an electric band, a cover band, rock and roll band. And then John went west, and I went north to art school in Ohio. And after I graduated there, I decided to come out west because the art form of the century, a phrase that was bandied about quite a bit back then, was cinema. And after a good firm grounding in design work, I decided to look into cinema through animation. I thought I was going to make my graphic designs move and bring them to life. And I got accepted into the same school that John had been going to. But shortly after that, my interest moved toward live action filmmaking. That seemed like it was where the action was, and I really liked it and was stimulated hugely by it. And so as John and some of my new friends, who were also John's friends, Nick Castle, for example, they were more or less leaving the school, either graduating or just finishing the work that they were doing there. And I was just getting in. So I got involved in all kinds of ways with my own projects, but also with projects that John was encountering, not only Dark Star, his student film, which we went on and made into a feature, but lots of students would turn to John for music. So I got involved in the music aspect of it that way. And so it was a nice little group of people who were friends and helping each other on each other's movies. And John and Dan O'Bannon were collaborating on Dark Star. Dan needed help in the various departments he was involved in. He was the production designer of the movie, and he didn't really have anybody knowledgeable about design work right around the cinema school at that point. So I stepped into that role as kind of his right hand and learned a lot from him. So then after Dark Star went out there and got John a little bit of attention, he landed a gig with, thanks to some independent money, that wound up being called Assault on Precinct 13. And because in the meantime he and Dan had kind of had a falling out, he turned to me for those. John always loved to work with his friends, naturally. And so he turned to me to help him on production design aspect of that. So I took on those duties. When the movie was in the can, I was accustomed, being a film student, to following the movie all the way to the finish. So I went to see John. He was cutting his own footage, which is notoriously difficult to do. But it was a very, very low-budget movie, and he was the best talent he could get in the cutting room for no money. And asked him if there was anything I could do, and he asked me if I could cut sound effects. And I boldly said yes, of course, and proceeded to learn on the job. And then later on in the process, he gave me most of the action sequences to cut. He was struggling with them somehow, and it worked out that he found me an effective editor as well. So it was only natural when Halloween rolled around that he would turn to me not only for production design, but for editing duties as well. I don't recommend the two jobs together because you don't get any sleep, but it was fun and very hard work, but also a huge learning experience. And Halloween was, I think for all of us, it was a combination of blindingly hard work. Again, when you're on a budget that low, you have to wear several hats. Everybody does.
Including head pumpkin carver, correct?
The art department, consisting of Randy Moore and Craig Stearns and myself, we were covering a lot of bases. First of all, I didn't know what the hell a production designer did. That is to say, in a union sense, I didn't know what the parameters of the job were. And so I wound up, taking care of a lot of location work and graphic design, and even had a pretty good hand in some of the costumes because my girlfriend, then to be wife, who was known then as Nancy Loomis, she was in charge of the costumes, and so I helped out in that department and took care of the costume work for the shape.
In fact, you've been credited as being a main determinator of the look of Michael Myers, the shape, in terms of the story I remember seeing played out in a documentary was, I think John sent you to go buy a few masks, and you came back with the famous William Shatner mask. You painted it white. And
I did a few other modifications to it, yeah.
So in a big way, Tommy, you are responsible for a lot of the look of Michael Myers. What do you have to say about that?
I think even John would say I am responsible totally for the look of Michael Myers. Yeah, I only wish I had a dime for every mask that is now being used, especially around Halloween. The script was asking for a blank-faced kind of mask. It's kind of vague, and there was absolutely no way we were going to be able to design it from scratch. Halloween was a $300,000 picture. And most of that money was going for really first-class equipment. John insisted on Panavision camera, widescreen, and Panavision lenses, which accounted to some degree, thanks to Dean Cundy's great skill, to a movie that looked far, far more expensive than its budget.
Absolutely.
Panavision equipment and lenses, MGM Labs, the best in town at that time, and Samuel Goldwyn sound facilities for post-production. John was absolutely insistent on those three areas, and it was a real bold stroke, but it meant that we had even less to work with budget-wise. So there was no question of designing a mask or coming up with something original from scratch. There was not the time and there was not the money to do it that way. It had to be something off the shelf that we, played with and made our own. I came up with two ideas: the blank-faced mask. The Captain Kirk mask was simply the blankest face on the shelf. And frankly, to me, it didn't even look like William Shatner. It just looked like a blank face, especially compared to the cartoony masks like Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford and Mr. Spock. Those were some of the other choices. It was an obvious choice to go for that one. But I also took John a different choice altogether, which was an Emmett Kelly clown mask. I always liked to give him choices, whether it was finding locations or vehicles or signs or anything else, the look of the set or any of it. I wanted him to have some leeway. And we tried the Emmett Kelly mask first. Emmett Kelly is the old-time sad sack clown. Got a real sad expression on his face. And it worked. It was dynamite. When the person came out and modeled the mask, we all agreed that, wow, that could work. That could be really spooky and eerie. And of course, ever since, clowns have been exploited in several ways. And I encountered it myself on It. And clowns are spooky, no question. But when the same person came out and modeled the other mask, the blank-faced mask, the effect was astonishing. It was just terrifying. looking. And there's some magic in there somewhere because there's just no explaining it. It's primal in some way. There's just something unsettling about that mask. We all realize that, hey, before we even get to the script or the situation or the beautiful lighting or the, tricky angles or the surprises and scares, we've got a movie. This is a terrifying thing. Just set up the camera and shoot this being wandering around in this mask, and we've got something. We knew that from the get-go.
That's an amazing story. And of course, John made the right choice. I think almost everybody would agree in terms of the mask. However, it is fascinating to think that Michael could have been Michael the Killer Clown, right?
Exactly. Could have been. But of course, I think John made the right choice. It was obvious to all of us how special it was.
Tell us more about your duties as production designer. I know in watching some of the documentaries, for example, you and your crew had to kind of put leaves in an environment where there were no autumn leaves. You had to rake them up after you were kind of throwing them into the shot.
We're talking about springtime in Los Angeles instead of fall in the Midwest. And anybody who actually knows what autumn is like back there, it's fantastic. It's moody, and it can be dreary and dark, or sunny and bright, but the leaves are turning all colors, and it's absolute magic. So the challenges were big, and we decided the best thing we could do was simply have falling leaves wherever we could find them, and leaves on the ground, and stay under canopies of moody, spooky trees wherever possible. I found South Pasadena to be a place that had some great streets that filled the bill. As to autumn leaves, you're absolutely right. We found branches of brown leaves in a floral decorator store. So they were precious. They weren't cheap. And so we saved every leaf, and we would gather them up, rake them, and put them in the garbage bags, and then use them for the next take. You'd put them in a box and give the box a little shake and have a fan going, and it would blow leaves through the scene. And it worked out fine. And for the most part, we shot around the palm trees. You asked about the scope of my job on Halloween. It was kind of all encompassing. I got into my department, thanks to Craig Stearns, covered the props, all construction, thanks to Randy Moore, all design work, that is to say, signage and graphics. Randy and I shared those duties. I found most of the locations. We didn't have an official location scout, and we didn't have an official casting director either, and I believe Deborah shouldered most of those duties. So you see how people just had to spread themselves into other departments in order to get all the work done.
Sure.
But if it was in the picture, I took it on as my duty.
So, Tommy, what was your experience in co-editing the film with Charles Bornstein? What were some of the challenges and rewards of editing the movie Halloween?
I was a good instinctive editor from cinema school days, and so I knew the basics. John added to those because I was with him in the cutting room all the way through Assault on Precinct 13, and I think we both learned some things together. We were cutting on film back then, celluloid film, and we would talk and discuss over frames, 2 frames, 3 frames here or there, what made a cut work better, what caused a cut to be noticeable versus one being virtually invisible to somebody who wasn't really looking, but was just absorbed in the film. When we got to Halloween, John was really starting to feel his oats as a director, and so he did a very effective job of supplying the cutting room with just all kinds of great scenes. Not terribly many choices because this was down to the bone budget. So there wasn't time to shoot tons of coverage. Mm-hmm. So scenes cut together fairly rapidly, and for the most part, we didn't have horrible problems getting the movie. The rough cut looked pretty similar to the final cut. I'd say most of the invention came about in the ending. The ending was invented in the cutting room, that is to say, all those empty streets, the shot of the empty streets. And
what a fantastic montage that is. That's really the tour de force editing job on the movie, in my opinion, that closing.
Well, thank you. I'm proud of it. We had to manufacture those shots out of nowhere because they were not set up shots of each of those scenes. We had to really pull that out of our hat to get all those shots together. And like I say, most of them were pre-slayed or at just before, after the actors leave the shot, and you've got this moment before the director says cut, and you have that much footage to work with. But it worked out great. I think it really adds to the movie.
So you went on to direct Halloween 3, Fright Night 2, the It television miniseries, among other titles. How was this film, Halloween, an important stepping stone for you? And what did you learn working on the picture that helped in your work to follow?
I would say the experience of watching John as he was really feeling his energy and his skills. So it was exciting to watch him develop his confidence. I think the thing that I learned more than any other from John was, one, whatever it is you're doing, keep it as simple as you can. Don't get too caught up in the complications of angles and shots. Just try and get to the story, get to the performances. He kept a fairly amiable set. He was very businesslike about what he wanted to get for the day. And he didn't fool around once he had a good take. There were no such thing as like take 12. It was always take 2 or 3 at the most. With good humor, though. The set was fairly light, and he was open to other people's ideas and thoughts as he went along. So all those things were soaking in for me. I think everybody has to go through this learning curve of learning that once you've got the action, hang around long enough to get reactions so the audience knows how they're supposed to be feeling about what's going on screen.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you for the recollections. It's all very fascinating, of course, being a fan of Halloween, but just as a fan of how movies are made, too. I love to hear recollections like this. So, Tommy, 40 years later, why and how is the film Halloween still important to you personally?
Halloween was important to me as an example of a movie that came together very well thanks to a good script, a good director, some good actors, and then all the other credits that fall into place, including Dean Cundy and myself as supporting all of that. You can take it for granted because it did fall together with a lot of hard work. It fell together rather easily in the end. But it doesn't come along every day, that kind of good chemistry. No one could have predicted the phenomenon it has become. We all knew we made a good movie, and we fully expected it to go out there and find an audience. It still, I think, raises eyebrows among all of us who were participants at the size of its power.
Why is this movie worth celebrating all these years later? In your opinion, why does it still matter, and how has it stood the test of time?
Well, I think anybody who enjoys being scared, who enjoys a horror movie, has to respect it as they would certain other favorites that are even older. My personal favorite is Invasion of the Body Snatchers. That's a well-made movie that I never get tired of watching it because it's so skillfully done.
Sure.
I think the same can be said of Halloween. It only matters to me in that it joins the inner circle of really excellent movies with good tight scripts and good performances.
Do you think the movie will still be widely watched and considered relevant in, let's say, another 40 years? What's your prediction?
I really couldn't say. The key is a well-made movie like Casablanca. It's a Wonderful Life, well-made movie, that contains something for people. I don't know if horror works the same way. I don't know if there's any great message to Halloween except to watch the hell out, Well, like Psycho, don't shower alone, stuff like that. I think it's kind of a joke to try and find meaning in horror movies. I think their job is to scare you.
I think you can look at predecessors, horror classics like, let's say, the original Frankenstein or Dracula or Psycho, for that matter, as you mentioned. Those are older films. Those are black and white movies to boot, and they're still being watched and treasured and talked about. Now, maybe not as treasured, perhaps, by younger generations, but if older generations do their due diligence and kind of recommend these films and try to pass them on to their children and the younger folks, then maybe there will be staying power for a movie like Halloween. But I think Halloween defies even those earlier predecessors in that you have such a classic monster, such an archetypal boogeyman, and a lot of that is the design, as you detailed earlier. I think that's going to go a long way toward the longevity of Michael Myers as well as the original Halloween. What would you say?
You can look at that mask at any year off into the future, and it'll still be scary. And maybe it'll stand the test of time. I think it certainly belongs in the pantheon in the horror world. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And if you look to rock and roll music, for example, fans of rock and roll music, it's not age sensitive. Even young people still know who Chuck Berry is, or Elvis. And I think the same rules apply in movies, that you have those who really love the genre are going to reach back and look at days gone by.
Tommy, do you still stay in touch with John Carpenter or anybody you work with on the original Halloween?
Yes, as you know probably, John and Nick Castle and I have always gotten enjoyment out of playing music together. Although we don't too much anymore, we do stay in touch. And certainly these days, we make appearances at some of these festivals. Mm-hmm. And typically we'll get together and have a bite to eat every few months.
Oh, that's great to hear. It's always nice to know that you're still rubbing elbows with the folks you had so much fun with earlier in your career. So, Tommy, what are you currently working on that listeners should check out? I read about Cineversary, for example, on IMDb. Is that something we should be keeping our ears perked up about?
Well, the title has changed to The Gate and may change yet again before we get this thing on in the can. Mm-hmm. But yes, indeed, that movie, I think we've found gotten a deal set up for financing. A couple of other titles that I'd like to mention. One called Scaryland, which is a horror feature about a group of teenage high school seniors who put together a haunted house project for a class fundraiser. Mm-hmm. And in so doing, things go horribly wrong. There's also a TV series that I'm excited about called Midnight Motel, which is kind of the apocalypse in Los Angeles in the near future. Only it isn't done straight. It's the apocalypse is the backdrop for an ordinary group of people in a motel up overlooking the city. It's a black comedy, and they're just trying to live their lives in the midst of this disaster.
Tommy, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me today and to our Cineversary listeners. And I wish you the best of luck in your future projects, and happy anniversary to Halloween.
Well, thank you, Erik. It's been a pleasure. I enjoyed it.
My thanks again to Tommy Lee Wallace for granting me an interview. All right, it's my pleasure to welcome Kyle Bishop as my next guest to talk about the 40th anniversary of Halloween. Why is this movie worth celebrating all these years later, Kyle? Why does it still matter, and how has it stood the test of time, in your opinion?
This is the quintessential horror film that sets it all out in a very fundamental, basic level in a lot of ways. Obviously, horror films existed before Halloween. Obviously, John Carpenter was drawing on an existing tradition, particularly Psycho. In my film studies classes, I always teach how film genres develop through kind of a developmental phase and then get into a classical phase. And I think Halloween really marks the beginning of the classical phase for the slasher subgenre, where it's building on Psycho and also, probably really importantly, Peeping Tom. Those films really kind of set the stage and developed what's going on in this film. Those are both from 1960. With Halloween, it's like, okay, here it is. Here's what it is. Here's how it works. And for a film to have that kind of a splash makes it a film that we need to reconsider and revisit and talk about. But like I said, the other reason why it's worth celebrating all these years later is it's still fantastic. It still works. It scares people. And I think that most horror film makers are just desperately trying to recreate what happened in this film. And I don't know if anyone has successfully managed to do that.
Totally, as PJ Souls would say. So I'm going to chime in here a little bit with some of my thoughts on this answer to this question. I think it's managed to stay relevant and interesting because of the quality filmmaking involved. So think about the film's style and aesthetics, the slow but regularly moving camera that is employed. And this creates an insecure, unsettled, paranoid, distorted reality. It also makes you feel that something is lurking behind every corner, and it forces you to look for clues everywhere in the frame.
Yes.
Carpenter and cinematographer Dean Cundey, think about it, they fill so many frames with masterful compositions. You've got rich foregrounds, middle grounds, and backgrounds. You got these deep blacks off in the background or in the periphery that reveal nothing until they suddenly reveal something. And you've got the wide angle lens aspect ratio. And so all these factors make you feel like something is hiding in the shadows or off to the side or just out of frame.
Oh, absolutely. It has a lot in common with Alien, which came out about the same time, right? If you go back and watch Alien carefully, you notice that that creature is often in the background when you're not aware of it.
That's right.
And I love how in this film the shape is often in the background. He's often just in the corner of the frame or out of frame. What makes it so terrifying is, yeah, the deep focus is great, but it's also that here's this monster who's just out in broad daylight. And he's not always in the closet or under the bed or behind the curtains. Oftentimes he's just standing in the middle of the road. He's standing on the sidewalk. And it's so frightening because of the boldness of this specter that we're not talking about jump scares so much, although they do occur. And it absolutely falls into the same category in Jaws in many ways, because you see him and you don't see him. And then Carpenter messes with us because every time he jumps out, we get a music cue, except for that iconic moment near the end of the film when he sits up again and it's dead silent. And so all those things work so well. And like I said, people try to imitate that. People try to keep the menace in the frame, or they try to keep you off balance, or they try to keep you looking and guessing. But this film does it so well because it's subtle, because it's quiet, because it's slow. And frankly, the film has almost no plot. But I don't care, because that's not the focus of the film. It's really just the pacing and the presentation, the cinematic presentation of the elements. And that holds up so well.
Yeah, I agree. The design of the film and its elements are minimalistic, but incredibly effective. So, Exhibit A is, as you said, the plot. It's hardly convoluted. Exhibit B, the look of Michael Myers, also referred to, as you said, the shape, is hauntingly stark and plain, and yet it's terrifying. It's got this bleached white, expressionless mask and uniformly bland mechanic's jumpsuit.
Right.
And that just works so well. Exhibit C, the music by John Carpenter, featuring only keyboards and synth sounds. He uses uncomplicated but repetitive themes to kind of ratchet up the tension.
Yes.
I think also what helps with the film's longevity, Kyle, is that the focus is more on suspense than gore.
Mm-hmm.
So surprisingly, there's very little blood or mutilation. Yes, there's on-screen violence, but not much in terms of splatter and body parts. I think it's also stood the test of time because Carpenter and his team, they learned valuable lessons from earlier horror film standouts, as you said, like Psycho, which used a subjective camera and voyeuristic techniques that Hitchcock used to try to make the audience complicit in the crime. So consider how the shower scene in Psycho is imitated by the young Michael Myers stabbing of his sister in the opening sequence to some extent.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the many callbacks to Psycho, including the name Loomis and, of course, the casting of Jamie Lee Curtis. The first-person perspective has been done before, but as I was watching it again, I could spend a whole class period on that opening 5 minutes, and I probably will next fall. One of the things that I noticed that is like Psycho, but a little different from Psycho. So we as the audience are looking through the young Mike Myers' eyes, but he never sees the knife in focus. For the most part, this is a film that does use that deep focus and doesn't manipulate us with it. But in the first person subjective perspective, we don't see the knife clearly because he never sees the knife clearly. Even during the act of violence against his sister, and when he looks at the knife, it's still blurred out. What he does see clearly is, of course, the rumpled bedclothes and his sister's exposed body. But I think it's so powerful on that kind of subliminal level when you are the killer and you don't know you're the killer and you don't know you're a little boy. All that stuff is so much more powerful than Psycho or Peeping Tom, where you establish the character you're seeing from whose perspective you're seeing in advance, and it's not as a shocking reveal by any means. So I think that opener is one of the key things about this film's success. And then, as you said, the score. This is hands down 100% the best, most effective horror film score in history.
Even more than Psycho, in your opinion?
Even more than Psycho. Psycho is iconic. Psycho is powerful, but this one is more effective. I would say Psycho and The Exorcist scores are probably second and third. I don't know which is which. And then, of course, Jaws is great. I generally don't put Jaws in with my horror film lists, but I think Jaws is a perfect film, perhaps one of the greatest films ever made, and it takes the same advantage. But overall, this score, even a little bit of it works. Even out of context, it works. And part of that is Carpenter did it in 5/4. 5/4 is disturbing. It's upsetting. You can't move to it normally. You can't process it normally. And so right out of the gate with that long zoom on the jack-o'-lantern during the title sequence, he is already messing everybody up before that iconic POV scene.
And the sparse and simplistic but unnerving score by Carpenter, as we've already discussed, it creates arguably the most instantly identifiable theme song for a horror movie and a minimalistic but effective assault on our nerves. I want to read you something that was written by Nat Bramer of Diabolique magazine. He said, Halloween, with maybe the exception of Suspiria before it, was the first score to be melodic and sinister at the same time. The score is always there, drifting between 2 or 3 repeating themes, and then going to a single note during acts of murder. The music is used less when Michael Myers is actually killing someone. The music aids this by focusing most on the tension and the build-up to the moment. Once the moment comes, the tension is over and the music drifts out. So ponder this, Kyle. When you picture Michael Myers in your head, it's almost impossible not to also have the theme song concurrently playing in your head. That's how powerful that score is.
Absolutely.
That's a nice segue, I should say, to my next question. In what ways do you think this film was influential on cinema and popular culture or set trends? So, for example, the subjective point of view, the camera shots that we were talking about, my opinion, they were inspirational. We see the stalking and the killings through the eyes of the killer or his victims and hear his heavy breathing.
Yeah.
You see this approach instantly aped in subsequent movies like, for example, the first Friday the 13th. So what's the benefit of this? Well, it forces you into a deeper, more involved participation, and thus the picture becomes a more visceral experience. Think about how the filmmakers would often begin with wide shots and slowly move in closer, framing tighter, creating a kind of claustrophobic feeling so that the viewer could identify with the character experiencing the encroaching fear. And then, as you said, that long opening take featuring an extended tracking shot that was made possible via they called it the Panaglide, but it was like a Steadicam, which is a new technology at that time. So those are all some interesting elements that I think were influential on cinema and popular culture.
That's obviously one of the big ones because it confronts the audience with their complicity as voyeurs of violence. Where in horror films, you go watch them and you think, well, at least I'm not participating. But of course, you are participating. And to put it through the eyes of the killer brings up those kind of ethical concerns, which I think is really powerful. This film is influential on horror films in half a dozen really, really important ways, some of which Carpenter intended and some of which he has denied intending. One of the big ones is it really set up the idea of the slasher film as the surprisingly conservative morality tale. And I've seen that in interviews. He said, that's not what I was doing. It's not supposed to be a morality tale. But as a literature professor, I can't help but say, so what? It doesn't really matter what he intended. What matters is that's what a lot of people got out of it. And the slasher films that follow Halloween, and they were legion, they loved to build on that idea of punishing the miscreant youth, and having ramifications for choices, and this evil force as also avenging angel, which complicates the reading of the monster. It also brings up the idea of the inventive kill, and as I've learned from other horror fans and other horror podcasts, that's one of the things that really draws a lot of people to these films, is they want to see a lot of people get killed in a lot of ways, a lot of inventive ways, a lot of new ways. And it's easy to look at Halloween today and say, yeah, so what? We've seen all this before. But as I always tell my students, you have to recognize that at the time you hadn't seen it before. It's maybe some of these things have become ubiquitous or standard or even stereotyped, but they weren't at the time. So I think that's super, super important. I love how it establishes the killer as silent, looming. I love that he never runs. He never moves particularly quickly. He never says a single word. I love that his humanity is almost entirely stripped from him with that dead fish mask. It is revealed. You get to see his face very briefly at the end. But for the most part, there isn't this moment of, and see who the killer is, see what the killer is like, see why the killer is what the killer is. You don't get a monologue from him. You don't get any of that stuff. And I think a lot of films that are effective have picked up on that.
It also reinforced the convention, I'm sure we'll get into this, the convention of the final girl, right? And that was earlier propagated by horror landmarks like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Black Christmas, and later echoed in movies like Alien and A Nightmare on Elm Street. And this movie also suggests an eerie ambiguity about the villain, too, that Michael Myers may simply be a cunning, insane person or a supernaturally gifted individual.
Right.
Perhaps most important of all, Halloween created an iconic archetypal monster who's possibly become the most famous, popular, and instantly recognizable horror icon of the past 50 years. Yes, Leatherface came first, right? But Michael Myers set the template for how to build a horror franchise around a killer character. And that's a template that would be copied by the Friday the 13th, the Nightmare on Elm Street, and the Child's Play, and even the Scream movies.
Yeah.
It also launched a whole series of copycat films like When a Stranger Calls and Prom Night and Graduation Day, New Year's Evil. There was Mother's Day, My Bloody Valentine, Silent Night, Deadly Night, and even April Fool's Day. And then my other point I want to make here is that critics often blame Halloween for setting the slasher subgenre in motion and introducing a steady output of increasingly sadistic, gory, and misogynistic horror movies. What's your feeling on that?
Well, I think that we're always going to get that from the critics. And horror is so interesting to me because it's generally embraced by what we might call the progressives or the leftists and condemned by the right. But the narratives are actually very conservative. Now, are they misogynistic? Sure, the killers are misogynistic. And if you want to argue that an audience that revels in the depiction of violence against women is misogynistic, it is complicated. But I think what we have to look at is the overall message, the overall story that's being presented. One of the things the Hays Code famously did back in the 20s and 30s was it didn't ban the depiction of crime and violence. It only required that any violent or criminal acts were ultimately punished,
That's right.
that the audience could see the results.
Mm-hmm.
And in these slasher films, even though the killers do invariably come back in the next film, they get what's coming to them. They're punished. It shows that there's a return to this natural order, and that it underscores that the violence is unnatural, that the abuse of women is ultimately unnatural.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, some of the most horrific, graphic, and kind of pejorative murders are committed towards men, often men who have already also exhibited some misogynistic behavior. So I think that the films can fairly be critiqued in that way, but I think they can also be analyzed in almost the opposite perspective. And largely that is because of the final girl trope that you mentioned. Carol Clover was the one who kind of famously coined that and talked about it a lot. And you're right, it was in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It was sort of in Psycho. It was, the germ was there. But I think Carpenter really brought that idea into focus. The final girl in Chainsaw Massacre is largely lucky. She kind of blunders her way to safety. And the violence in that film, I do think, is a little gratuitously misogynistic. We watched this girl be tortured. With Halloween, we get a different kind of final girl. We get a girl who is coded overtly from the beginning as smart, clever, capable, aware of her surroundings. conscientious of other people.
Right.
And then she continues to be coded, very importantly, I think, in terms of a nurturing mother figure. Jamie Lee Curtis was obviously physically attractive, but at no point does Carpenter sexualize her. She's never scantily clad. She's never undressed. She's presented as the responsible babysitter. She's the one who takes care of the children.
Mm-hmm.
She tellingly calls them her babies when she hugs them at the end. And yeah, she is sober and chaste and virtuous. She does smoke a joint, but she feels bad about it. So at least we have that. She openly refers to herself as a Girl Scout. So this type of final girl, the virtuous woman, the woman hero, the woman warrior, is codified by Carpenter in a way that wasn't prior to Halloween. And that's the final girl everyone started to copy and emulate. That's why in some ways, when you ask how was it influential on cinema, I think its primary influence on other films is the final girl character, which has transcended the horror genre and appears in all types of films today.
Yeah, that's some really good insights there, Kyle. Thanks for sharing that. Let's get into the moral to the story here. What themes or messages are explored in Halloween? I want to go back to something you said a little bit ago about how immorality will be punished. So the trope of the final girl is more firmly established in this film, and that suggests that Laurie Strode survives the Shape's onslaught because she's not preoccupied by sex. She doesn't indulge in promiscuity. She doesn't lose her virginity. She didn't, as you said, abandon the children. She's responsible for babysitting, and she's smarter and demonstrates more agency than her peers.
Oh, I agree with that completely. And it's interesting that I read this morning that Carpenter said, come on, it's just a scary movie. But he does point out, and I think this is accurate, the other teenage characters in the film spend their entire time very, very distracted. They are selfish characters who want to indulge in their own desires, which results in them being dismissive of the children, inattentive to the environment around them. They don't notice the Shape the way Laurie does. And so part of Laurie's morality is simply a responsibility. It's an awareness. It's a soberness that is not just the fact that she doesn't drink. She's a sober person. And so with all deference to John Carpenter, I think what he has done has created a morality tale, almost in the vein of the Canterbury Tales, where it's like, let's follow these characters and let's see what they do and how they act, and emphasize at almost every opportunity the fact that being virtuous and true and responsible and honest will serve you well in the end, if not lead directly to your survival. I don't think Carpenter is necessarily saying bad behavior is punished. I think it is, but I think that's kind of a side effect of good behavior is rewarded. And I think it benefits to look at films, the horror films, from that perspective as well.
Kyle, you also mentioned a few minutes ago how this film may espouse a conservative morality, one that Carpenter himself kind of tried to rebut. But consider the evidence of that theory. So those who are killed are sexually promiscuous and drug users, although, as you said, Laurie does take a hit on the joint. According to AMC film site writer Tim Dirks, Halloween, quote, asserted the allegorical idea that sexual awakening often meant the literal death of innocence or oneself, unquote. And Dr. Loomis, if you recall, he calls the boy pure evil.
I met him 15 years ago. I was told there was nothing left. No reason, no conscience, no understanding, and even the most rudimentary sense of life or death, of good or evil, right or wrong. I met this 6-year-old child with this blank, pale, emotionless face and the blackest eyes, the devil's eyes. I spent 8 years trying to reach him, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up, because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
A psychiatrist is supposed to, analyze human behavior, not form black and white moral judgments. So these point to perhaps a conservative take on the movie.
I agree. I think it is a morality tale. And there's nice clues in the text that underscore that. So I mentioned earlier that when we're looking through young Mike Myers' eyes, just before he murders his sister, he very pointedly looks at the bed. And so there's this very clear sense of, okay, I premeditatively got the knife and put the mask on. But it seems like the catalyzing moment is when he realizes, okay, she has had sex with her boyfriend. And then he sees his sister in a state of undress where she's mildly but not explicitly sexualized, and that spurns him to kill her. And so it's pretty much that he does seem to, for the most part, kill those who are engaging in illicit sexual behavior and sparing those who don't. Now, does it work across the board? No. The truck driver was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The first victim of the Halloween night wants to have sex but never gets the opportunity, although she is scantily clad. So I think it's there. I don't think it's as heavy-handed as would appear in later films. I think Friday the 13th is much more blatant in this kind of idea of the killer is going to punish those who are misbehaving because, of course, the killer says as much. It's much more heavy-handed, where I think this film is open to a lot more interpretation and could make the audience a little more uneasy, as they maybe are prone to evaluate their own moral behavior.
I think a couple other themes worth exploring. The film also suggests that a small, quiet town can harbor dark secrets, that there's a dark side to suburbia. And that's something, of course, David Lynch explored in Blue Velvet, right? And then you have the concept of unavoidable fate. So recall that Laurie's teacher says that fate is immovable, like a mountain. There's that whole kind of back and forth kind of morality tale being espoused in the classroom there that Laurie chimes in about.
No line is frivolous in this film.
Right.
There's not a lot of dialogue, really. And so everything that is presented or said or seen is relevant to the story. And it's such a great minimal film for that reason. But the shape is the unavoidable impending approach of fate, of doom, the idea that you can't necessarily escape it. He has that kind of, and this is lighthearted, so excuse me, but he has kind of that Pepe Le Pew quality. He just keeps coming. He's just there, and you can run and you can hide and you can trip and you can fall, and he's just going to keep coming. It's that nihilistic sense of your future is outside of your control. And until we get to the showdown with Laurie, that's true. Nobody is able to stop this guy, avoid this guy, get out of his way. He's a juggernaut of justice, perhaps, of vengeance, perhaps, or as Loomis tells us, simply chaos, of evil, of entropy. And it's not till the end that it asks some questions of, can you change your fate? Can you challenge this? And ultimately, through a very deft use of the rule of three, Laurie stabs him 3 times. He is potentially or supposedly killed 3 times. He comes back to life 3 times. And all of this, whether Carpenter meant to or not, is deeply biblical in nature.
Wow.
And it's very much that idea of you can't escape. This is going to happen. It is going to come. It is going to get you. And that's why I think the ending of the film is brilliant, where it's just, he's gone, close credits. And I think there is something to that.
Yeah, that's a fascinating take. I never realized the rule of 3 in effect there. Also the fact that she's the final girl, this trope that's kind of more solidified by this film. What's interesting is she doesn't necessarily vanquish the foe as maybe other final girls will.
Correct.
It really, of course, takes Loomis to at least get him off of her. He's choking her to death. Now, of course, the suggestion is, and we learn later in the sequels, he has not died. But the suggestion here is that the final girl isn't necessarily all it's going to take to vanquish the villain.
Right. And I think that it was still developing at that point. I don't love the fact that she has to be rescued by the older dude, but I can kind of see where that plays, especially in 78. But I do love how, and Carpenter apparently went on record as saying, when he was kind of challenging some people's reading of the sexual allegory, that Laurie is the most sexually repressed of all of them. Mm-hmm. And she's trying to come to terms with that in some terms, because maybe she doesn't want to be. Because he said she keeps attacking him with phallic weaponry. And I think that's great, and I think that's awesome. I'm a Freudian in my literary studies. But I also love the fact that she attacks him with a knitting needle, and then with a clothes hanger, and then with a knife. And all 3 of those weapons, while indeed phallic, are also fundamentally domestic. And so here we have the woman who is representing the motherly figure, who is attacking the home invader in the home to protect the children, using kind of the tools of domesticity. But then we find out that those tools of domesticity are ultimately ineffectual against this juggernaut.
And what's interesting that plays into your earlier thought about how if they are phallic symbols and yet she's the most repressed sexually of all the characters, I guess it makes sense then that she quickly discards those phallic symbols. She quickly throws away the knife to the consternation of the viewer. Well, why would you throw the knife away? Keep the knife.
Right.
So it ends up we're talking to the screen and getting mad at her, but that may play into that theory a little bit.
No, because she uses them in some ways better than he does. And then, yeah, Loomis shoots him, but it's a weaker phallic symbol at best, and ultimately proves again ineffectual. So I think as much we could spend a lot of time on the first 5 minutes, but I think you could spend as much time on the last five, because it is a complex ending that leaves a lot of things unresolved. Not only the plot and the fate of the shape, but also what exactly is the message? What is the morality here? Is this feminist or misogynistic? Is this pro-women or pro-status quo? Is it liberal or conservative? And that's, to me, is one of the things that makes a wonderful, rich text, is an ending that does not result in a consensus of interpretation. I think it's fantastic.
And it's pretty consistent with so many Carpenter films where
Yeah.
you have these ambiguous endings where all the loose ends are not neatly tied up. And to me, the last sequence in the movie is the most brilliant. The editing choices of once we see the shape is no longer on the lawn, we suddenly have a great montage of shots showing where he had previously been or where he could still be popping out of the shadows. So we almost retrace our steps back through the house, back through the neighborhood, and it creates this eerie, unnerving suggestion that the evil is still there. It's not going away. It could emerge at any time and terrify the hell out of us. To me, and I learned this in watching a few documentaries about Halloween, that was kind of invented. It wasn't pre-planned, that ending, that montage I described. That was invented in the editing room, and it really, to me, is what caps off brilliantly this movie.
I agree.
So, Kyle, who do you think this film appealed to initially when it was released in its original year, 1978? And who do you think it appeals to today? If that appeal has changed, what does that say about the film's impact, influence, and legacy?
I think initially it was really directed towards the subjects of the film. I think this was a teenage film. I think it was to scare young couples on dates. I think it was to propose to the high school, college age viewer that you may not be as safe as you think you are, that there may be a boogeyman, even though you're too old to believe in him. He may still be in the closet or out back or at the door. I think, again, there is a little bit of a conservative message of morality to young people. Watch out, be responsible, do what you're told, take care of your siblings, that kind of stuff. So I think it really was kind of a teenage angled film, because most horror films are geared towards the teenage audience. Teenage boys love to take teenage girls to horror films, so they'll scream and hang on tightly. Young girls, teenage girls, love to go to horror films together so they can scream together and laugh at each other. There is that sense of the horror film is the dare, where you're going to edge each other into seeing it. The horror film is the one you go to, and then you take your friends a second time so you can watch them get scared. And all those things are true today, which is why it's such a successful genre.
Yeah, I have no doubt that the film attracted plenty of older teens and young adults originally in 78, as you talked about. I think today there's a lot of nostalgia for this
Correct.
film, which means 50-somethings and older probably place it high on their all-time horror film lists, like you and I, and they revisit it somewhat regularly. But the fact that they're releasing a reinvention of this franchise with a new Halloween film in October tells you that the original movie's appeal today spans multiple generations. I also believe that reviewers take the 1978 movie a lot more seriously today than many did 40 years ago, and that means it's more deserving of critical respect and scholarly study.
I agree completely. I think you're right. I think about the nostalgia and the kind of scholar historian side is where this film appeals most. I think the people who remember it, who were young when it came out, still love it, and they love what memories and emotions it turns back up in them. And I think it is the focal point of a lot of horror studies, if not at least the starting point. My read, based on successful horror films of the last 5 to 10 years, is most teenage young adult audience members would find this terribly slow, terribly boring, terribly underwhelming, not violent enough, not bloody enough. Because again, while rescreening it, there is almost zero profanity, there's almost zero blood, most of the violence is implied, and the nudity isn't shocking. It's a pretty tame film in its state. And so I'm very curious to see what the new film is going to be like. And I'm super fascinated by the idea of we're going to make a sequel to the original and just pretend all the other films don't exist. I'm fascinated by how that's going to work from a series standpoint or an adaptation standpoint. If you look at the remakes of slasher films lately, or the new slasher films lately, they are so over the top and so heavily influenced by MTV style editing and instant gratification of the internet and social media that a lot of these horror films today don't scare me. They just make me numb. I will go on record as saying I am not a fan of Rob Zombie's remake of this film, although I think Zombie is a very interesting filmmaker. I think every single thing that worked in Carpenter's film, Zombie undermines and removes from his film. So I'm fascinated to see what the new one will look like, if it's going to be in a more modern style or harken back to Carpenter's style. And I'm interested to see how well it plays with younger viewers, because I think you're right. I think the audience for that film are us, are the people who love the original and have that nostalgia.
Kyle, what elements from this movie have aged well and what are showing some wrinkles?
This may be a weak answer, but I honestly think everything has aged well. Just watching it again this week, I don't think anything is showing wrinkles. It's definitely now a period piece, and it's so fun to go back and watch a contemporary film that has become a period piece. But the language, the hairstyles, the dress, none of that bothers me because the film takes place in 78, and it looks like 78. And yeah, it's supposed to be in Illinois in October, but it looks like Southern California in the spring. That's fine. That doesn't bother me. But as far as the frights, as far as the story, as far as the shots, as far as the scares, as far as that amazing score, none of that was less effective in my recent screening as in my initial screening. I think this film holds up almost perfectly.
Yeah, I got to agree in a lot of those points. I will point out a few things that maybe haven't aged so well, but just small nitpicking. Again, I'm a huge fan, so these are just small quibbles. But the Haddonfield neighborhood we see depicted, it doesn't look very Halloween season appropriate.
Right.
Again, they're shooting California in the spring, so you also have very few kids out trick-or-treating. You have a little bit of a sequence in the daylight of that. But second, there aren't a lot of autumn leaves on the ground or colorfully splashed across the trees. So that kind of shows a little bit of inferiority there. But one website I found insists that PJ Souls says the word totally 11 times. I got to tell you, every time I watch it, I can't help but snicker. I've learned to kind of let it go. But boy, the first few times I revisited this movie a few years ago, it really bugged me. But again, a period piece. It's kind of a vernacular of the time, perhaps. So in my opinion, the shot of the young Michael Myers being demasked by his parents also lingers a little far too long. It's that great shot where they kind of pull back. I think it's a crane shot. But those parents are just standing there nonplussed while their little boy is holding a bloody knife and looking catatonic. That doesn't age so well to me. But again, those are small quibbles. So almost everything else besides the 1970s hairstyles and the wardrobe fashions, I think everything else holds up incredibly well, especially, as has been discussed, the cinematography, the wide angle compositions, the editing, the POV shots, the creepy humor, like Michael Myers donning the bed sheet to fool PJ Souls.
Right.
And the decision to keep Mike's face, his backstory, and his motivations relatively mysterious. I think those all hold up really, really well.
Right. And just underscores again the failure of Zombies remake or any of the recent films. You know, this is not a kid who was traumatized, who was abused, who is dealing with emotional or identity issues. He's just evil. And it still works because we still have evil. I think a lot about that slow pullback from the revealed child Myers. And it is awkward and it is weird. Why are they just standing there? Why aren't they concerned about the bloody knife? But to me, it just makes me all the more upset. It just makes that whole opening very disorienting and uncomfortable and raises so many more questions than it would ever answer.
This is a birthday celebration after all, and birthdays are all about presents, except it's the fans who continue to get the gifts. Kyle, what is this film's greatest gift to viewers?
Kind of in a blanket sense, just its legacy. If this is the classic embodiment of the slasher subgenre, the gift that we get is all the films that followed in its wake, all the films that learned valuable lessons from it, all the films that work better because Halloween came before them. When you track the progress from Halloween to Scream, because obviously I think Scream is a fantastic film, it doesn't exist without this movie. And then as we get into kind of a horror renaissance of the 21st century, it all harkens back to Halloween. So I think that the legacy is what is the gift. And of that legacy, I think it's the Final Girl as much as it is anything else. And just how do you make a really low budget, really simple, really eloquent, terrifying movie? That's Halloween.
Yeah, in my opinion, the greatest gift is you've got a high quality horror film that fans can be proud of. Consider that horror is regarded by many film critics, scholars, historians, and viewers to be often a bastard stepchild genre that so often produces things putrid over pristine. It's nice to have an unimpeachable horror classic that can rank high with giants of the genre like Psycho or The Exorcist or Jaws, for example.
Yeah.
Plus, Michael Myers and John Carpenter's score, they become emblematic touchstones of the genre. Today, hardly any child dresses up as Frankenstein, Dracula, or the Wolfman for Halloween anymore, but you definitely see plenty of kids proud to wear the Michael Myers cosplay, despite the fact that this is a 40-year-old character, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Do you think this movie will still be widely watched and considered relevant in another 40 years? Why or why not?
I think so. I hope so. I absolutely hope so. I think for those of us in the academic world, it absolutely will be. And I think it just has that longevity. Because in film studies, we still worship Citizen Kane, right? It's this idea of this film came out and its subtle complexity, its innovation, its influence on others, it's still there. And I will go on record as saying Halloween is the Citizen Kane of horror films.
Wow.
You cannot understand contemporary horror without considering Halloween. And I don't see how that's going to be any different 40 years from now.
Yeah, my take is that, just as many people revisit old-time Christmas classics in December, like Miracle on 34th Street, It's a Wonderful Life, Christmas Story, I think future generations are going to continue to watch Halloween in October, and other months for that matter, but especially the Halloween season. And as movies and audiences continue to tolerate more violence in film as the years pass, I think the first Halloween will actually be considered fairly tame as an R-rated movie. You've already mentioned that, right? But that could actually increase its reach to younger ages. Not that I agree with allowing kids to watch this movie, but I think you know where I'm coming from.
No, and that was such a masterstroke. If this had been called The Babysitter Murders, which was the original name, I don't know if it would have the repeatability. The film would still be brilliant, but the marketing wouldn't have worked. And you're right. You call it Halloween. I mean, it's not the Halloween murders or it happened one Halloween or death comes to Halloween. It's just Halloween.
It has got the market cornered on the title Halloween.
It is the go-to film for October and will be forever.
So, Kyle, what are you currently working on that listeners should check out? Any new books or other projects?
I did put together a book called How Zombies Conquered Popular Culture, where I look specifically at the zombie figure in the 21st century. I'm relatively proud of it. I think it's a pretty decent read. It's not too expensive on Amazon.
Fantastic.
And then I worked with a colleague to put together a collection of essays on zombie literature, which is in stark contrast to most horror film. With zombies, the films came before the books. Where in most cases the books come first. So we have a book called The Written Dead, which is a series of critical essays on zombie books, zombie stories, and things like that. Otherwise, what I primarily work on is teaching.
Can you name drop a couple of those courses?
Sure. I'm teaching a class right now on short form cinema, which is not just short films, but also things like movie videos and film trailers and bumpers. We're doing that. I teach a film history class. I do an adaptation course on film adaptations, and I'm working with Dracula. Last year I did Frankenstein. I try to keep pretty busy in terms of my teaching. And then every so often, every year or so, I pop out an academic article in an obscure journal that no one ever reads.
We'll definitely keep our eyes peeled for these things.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm so thrilled to have been part of your show.
I couldn't think of a better guest to really get into the nitty gritty of this movie beside yourself. It was a treat to talk to Tommy Lee Wallace, obviously, but when I wanted to really get into the heart of this with an academician, with a scholar, I thought of you, and I'll continue to listen to Horror Movie Podcast and hope you continue to make appearances on there.
My goal will be to do that again. Things are shifting in my life so that I can maybe appear on more podcasts. I find it terribly enjoyable.
Well, that's awesome. Hey, I want to thank you again for taking the time, and happy Halloween season, Kyle.
Happy Halloween to you as well.
All right, before we conclude, I wanted to give a shout out to my standing ovation for October. This is where I give a shout out to a movie, book, website, TV program, podcast, or other work that I think would be of interest to classic film lovers. My first standing ovation this month goes out to the new Halloween movie set to open this week, starring Jamie Lee Curtis and directed by David Gordon Green. It currently holds a Rotten Tomatoes score of 86%. I've already pre-ordered my ticket, and I'm looking forward to seeing that film in a movie theater in just a few days. My second standing ovation goes to the aforementioned Horror Movie Podcast, which Kyle Bishop occasionally appears on for color commentary. Horror Movie Podcast is a bi-weekly show that offers deep dives into classic as well as modern fright films and provides an entertaining experience thanks to the chemistry between co-hosts Jay of the Dead, Wolfman Josh, and Dave Dr. Shock Becker. Give it a listen. Prior to calling it a night, I also want to encourage you to check out a website, cineversegroup.blogspot.com. That's my portal for the Cineverse Film Discussion Group that I launched 13 years ago and which continues to meet weekly in the South Suburban Chicago area. We're a democratic film society that watches and then discusses a predetermined movie that our members pick on a rotating basis. At cineversegroup.blogspot.com, and Cineverse is spelled Cineverse, you can hear podcast recordings of our group discussions and read more about the films we study. The reason I created Cineverse and this podcast you're listening to is to foster an appreciation for and intelligent dialogue about memorable films. Watching a movie is fun, but to me, interpreting it, talking about it, and sharing opinions and theories about it, that's even more enjoyable. I find the real pleasure is in digging deeper to learn how and why a film was made, the impact it's had on culture, society, and other movies, why that movie has the power to evoke a strong emotional reaction in each of us, and what it can teach us for that matter. We also have a Cineversary Podcast Facebook page at facebook.com/CineversaryPodcast. You can go there for more information on current or future episodes, post a comment or suggestion there for a memorable movie about to celebrate a major anniversary, maybe even one you think would be worthy of an episode of this podcast. And while you're there, please like us on Facebook too. If you'd like to email me a comment or a suggestion, you can get a hold of me, Erik Martin, at cineversegroup@gmail.com. Also, please spread the good word about this show to your kith and kin, and if you like this podcast, leave us a good review on whatever platform you hear it from, especially iTunes. We really appreciate that. Lastly, plan to tune in next month for our November episode of Cineversary. That's when we'll celebrate the 60th anniversary of Orson Welles' noir masterpiece, Touch of Evil, with my special guest, one of the world's foremost experts on Welles, Jonathan Rosenbaum. Make your plans to join us for that. This has been your humble host, Erik Martin, reminding you to butter up that popcorn, live a big screen surround sound life, and cherish those classic movies because they're not getting older, folks. They're getting better. Thanks again for giving us a listen, and happy Halloween.